In love, let us abide. In hope, rejoice. In tribulation, endure. And in prayer, persevere. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Please be seated. How do we respond to the unfamiliar? How do you respond to the unfamiliar? My first job in administration was as a high school assistant principal at the high school that I went to. It was familiar to me, its people, its students, its families, and I was excited and thought, I'm ready. It took less than a week to realize that I was in a familiar space, in a familiar place, but an unfamiliar space. And that my desire, my focus was to do what's best for kids. I discovered that that wasn't everybody's focus, and that this was especially true if a student didn't meet the expectation or the norm. Now, let me pause here to say that I believe that teaching is a calling and a ministry, and it's a sacred one. And teachers and counselors and the ladies in the front office, the ladies and men in the front office, the nurse, the bus drivers, all those folks, most of them are doing amazing work in sacred ways supporting kids. But some are not. And I remember the man that hired me on the first day said to me, "Now, Rachel, I want you to remember something. It's only about 10% of the population that's causing about 90% of the problems." And that's a mantra that I still use today. My responsibilities were not limited to, but included attendance and discipline. And here's where I found the bulk of my work and some colleagues who had strong convictions about what should or shouldn't be done with students who had attendance and discipline issues. And I heard some things from them because they were familiar with these kids, and I wasn't. I was too long-suffering. I gave too many chances. I didn't uphold the discipline policy. I didn't uphold the attendance policy. I was trying to be friends with the kids. Why didn't you just do it the way Mr. So-and-so did it when he was the assistant principal? And my favorite is, if I were you, I would. I tried to engage with my colleagues and explain that my goal was to build relationships with students in order to let them know that I cared, that we cared about them. I was told by some that wasn't my job. My job was to discipline, to let the punishment fit the crime. And you can't talk to those kids. They don't want to change. And the most tragic response of all, you just need to give up on that one. Giving up on a kid was unfamiliar to me. I tried to share some of the situations that students were facing. Students weren't falling asleep or missing school because they didn't care or they were trying to be disrespectful. Some of those kids were missing school and were late because they had jobs that helped supported their families. Students weren't lashing out with colorful language and big reactions because it was a personal attack at the teacher. They were usually reacting out of fear, anxiety, or in a way that worked for them in one space, but not in a school setting. And I told them, I tried to communicate that if we took the extra time to build relationships, that we could work together with students to create support systems and maybe accommodations that would help them with attendance and with behavior. Well, this response, or this way of responding, was unfamiliar to a lot of folks. And needless to say, it was a tough year. I wish I had the tools then that I have now after 2 years of seminary in my toolbox. And I wish I could tell you that I consistently responded with grace, curiosity, and love. and invited my colleagues to do that as well. But I didn't. I was passionate about caring for kids, all the kids. I wasn't passionate about communicating the need to build relationships with teachers and students, and I wasn't especially patient about folks getting on board with this new way of being. And I wasn't the assistant principal the next year. Our passage from Luke today has elements of the unfamiliar. And I believe this parable is one of deep lament. John the Baptist and Jesus were doing new and wondrous things, but they were acting in unfamiliar ways in familiar spaces and places. John and Jesus were not behaving in the way that these folks were familiar with. And the responses were not kind. John the Baptist has a demon. Jesus is a drunkard, a glutton, hanging out with tax collectors and sinners. And it pulls me back to the question that I started with. How do we respond to the unfamiliar? I wonder if we might be like these folks sometimes when we're faced with the unfamiliar. We find ourselves in an unfamiliar place, with unfamiliar people, or faced with unfamiliar ways of being, knowing, and doing. Maybe a place like seminary. We might respond well, but we might not. We might respond out of fear or anxiety or some other emotion. What could I possibly mean? Well, let me share with you some of my first responses to this unknown land of seminary. First year, first semester, second week, I call my sending priest. And I say to him, by the way, he's a Southwest alum. Listen, Daniel, I know I'm not Elijah and Jezebel ain't after me. I'm not Jonah headed to Nineveh, but I understand why these folks fled the call. I'm in Jennings' class, and he's talking about the eschaton, and it feels like the eschaton because I don't know if he's talking about a Russian theologian or an outside linebacker for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I go to Bishop's class. It's the Old Testament. I thought I knew the Old Testament. I'm a former Baptist. And he's talking about Marduk and some kind of dragon. Then I come to chapel. And they don't do it the way we did it at St. Elizabeth. I don't understand that. And then I go to Tomlinson's class. And he's hitting me with all the feels. And he wants me to feel all the feels. And just so you know, I've already cried on Dan's couch once. And you know what this man of God does? He laughs. And he says, yeah, that sounds about right. Please don't worry. He was incredibly pastoral and supportive in that conversation and every conversation we've had after. And when I look back now, after putting the work in with many of you in this room, my spiritual director, my therapist, and others, I realized I was anxious, I was fearful, and I was carrying around an incredible amount of shame. And from these places came responses that were unhelpful, unsupportive, ungracious, and overly critical in some spaces and places and with those around me, and most of all, to myself. These were familiar responses applied to the unfamiliar, and they simply did not serve. I think my responses might be like some of the responses we heard in Luke today. Folks just didn't respond well to the unfamiliar, even when the unfamiliar had the possibility of relationship, and a relationship with Christ. You know, I told you I wasn't rehired as the assistant principal the next year, and I wasn't. I was offered a different position. A position to help students with attendance, discipline, and academic issues. We were going to be a school within a school. And this kind of thing is not unfamiliar anymore. It's actually the norm. This is the way we support students now in all different kinds of schools across the country. I had a chance to respond to the unfamiliar in another way. And I wanted to, and I had to, because for some of these kids, it was the last chance. And I didn't need to sing the same old song or play this flute the same way for the naysayers. The students needed the adults to build bridges and not barriers. And I was so fortunate to have a loving counselor and an amazing assistant to come alongside me to help me in this work. Because you know what? These students were now thrust into the unfamiliar as well. And so when somebody jumped up after the third time of taking a chemistry exam and slammed their fist down on the table and sang out a colorful expression of their frustration, we had to react in a firm but different way. And the sad thing was that students expected, I think, to be kicked out, sent home that day, but no, we did something different. We had conversations, hard conversations, and used the experiences as a teachable moment to build trust and to build relationship. Now, don't get it twisted. It didn't work for everyone, and some folks decided to leave and some were asked to leave, but it was rare, less than one student a year. And some folks still had ungracious and critical refrains. But you know what? As we grew, as we were doing this thing and we grew into this unfamiliar place and space, the voices of the students, their parents, their grandparents, other educators, school board members, and a divinely powerful, loving group of cafeteria ladies drown that old refrain out. And I want to call attention to those ladies, those divinely loving cafeteria ladies. They were like the wisdom in this parable. They were the first to love these kids hard and support this program. So how do we respond to the unfamiliar? Maybe a better question is, how do we want to respond to the unfamiliar? My hope for us is that we want to be curious, gracious, and loving. That we encounter the unfamiliar with questions that spark engagement, that build bridges, that break down barriers, and that maybe, just maybe, we sing out a passionate, inclusive, loving new song that allows us to dance joyously together. My prayer for us is that when we are faced with the unfamiliar, we seek out the Holy Spirit and her wisdom, and that we shine forth responses that are born in and out of Christ's love. The love he has for each of us and the love that he wants us to have for each other. Thanks be to God.